You watched me predict the rise of President Trump. You watched me predict his change from he's Hitler into, well, he's effective, but we don't like it. You watched me describe how a North Korean denuclearization deal could happen before it happened. And now I'm going to raise the ante again and show you how to use persuasion to solve the opioid crisis. All right, not solve. Solve is a little bit of an overclaim. But persuasion is going to be part of the answer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do it right, how to do it wrong. Now, you may have seen that in President Trump's his proposals for dealing with the opioid crisis. A small part of that is he said something about advertisements or, public social media outreach to try to essentially persuade people to stay away from opioids. Now, as soon as you heard that, probably something clicked in your brain and you said, oh, wait a minute. That's already been tried. If you're a certain age, you already know this, that back in the days of Reagan, Nancy Reagan famously tried to persuade people to stay off drugs, and the persuasion worked like this. Just say no.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
That was it. That was the slogan. Just say no to drugs. Now, people say, well, that didn't work. It didn't seem to make any difference. It was a lot of effort, no noticeable difference. And so people say, well, history repeats itself. If we do that same thing that didn't work, just say no. Or as I like to say, just say no. Just say no. If we try to persuade again, well, it's going to fail again because history repeats, right? If you don't learn anything from history, you're doomed to repeat it. This is another example of why I say that's the dumbest thing anybody can ever think in terms of a filter on reality. History never repeats. It just feels like it sometimes. So if that's your level of thinking, well, it didn't work last time, won't work this time, you're not really involved in anything like reason or logic or rational thought. It just feels like it. Because it feels like history repeats, but it doesn't. And let me tell you why in this particular example. If you know anything about persuasion, and we as a society have learned a great deal since the Reagan era. If you know anything about persuasion, you know that the phrase, just say no, is probably working against its own purpose. Right? The idea that you're telling young, rebellious people, hey, here's something you shouldn't do. Does that make it less popular? Well, not really, because it's sort of a thing that people always knew they were doing, out of sight of parents and away from the law and when their teacher isn't looking. So if we're talking about young people in particular. And so just say no was exactly the wrong kind of persuasion. So to say that if we tried to persuade on opioids, we would also get a bad result doesn't really track because it hasn't been tried in a way that you could call a good try. So I'm going to suggest a way to get closer to persuading people on opioids. And here I'm talking about the person who might be tempted to try it for the first time, who is usually young. All right, so the people who are dying from the opioids, they skew younger. And here's what I think worked with the persuasion and tobacco. I believe this is true. Fact check me on this, but I believe it's true that the public commercials and persuasion to get kids to stop smoking probably was effective. Now, other things probably happened, like the cost of cigarettes went up and, maybe there's more enforcement, more penalties for selling to minors. So there might be other reasons that the kids are smoking a lot less than they used to. But I think a part of that was because, yeah, the packaging, etc. But I think a part of that is also that the public commercials were fairly effective. All right. Now you're already ahead of me in the comments. If you think of the anti-tobacco commercials, they were first of all very visual, right? And if I've taught you anything, it's that visual persuasion is the best. Compare the pictures of like a lung that's just destroyed by smoking tobacco. You can never get that into your head. That's very persuasive. Compare that to Nancy Reagan's slogan, just say no. There's no picture. There's no visual. It's not an accident that the Just Say No campaign didn't work. There's nothing about it that is active. There's no way it could have worked. It was more like wishful thinking. Real persuasion looks more like the anti-tobacco ads. But I would suggest that maybe the most effective part of those commercials, and I don't know if there's a way to measure this or if anybody's ever tried, but just based on theory, the most effective part of those commercials is probably when they pitted the big bad tobacco corporations against the students, and the commercials made it seem as though it was a competition, or the tobacco companies themselves were the evil enemy who was trying to abuse you.
You never see the face of big tobacco, but they see you. They see you as an easy target. Are you?
So it's first of all very effective to set up an enemy. All right? Just say no. Well, there's sort of a conceptual implied enemy maybe who is perhaps the dealer, but not really. Just say no is mostly about yourself, like just try harder. Whereas the tobacco commercials said very clearly, here's you. You're minding your own business. Here's the tobacco companies manipulating your minds, destroying your lungs for their greedy profits. All right? So an us against them is always effective. But here's what else is effective. Tobacco companies are older people, and kids just don't like old people, just biologically, right? Everybody's different, of course. But as a general statement, young kids at the, do I want to smoke or not age, don't want to spend a minute around grandma. They don't want to spend a minute around old people. And I think it's just a biological reflex, right? They're more drawn to people their own age, more drawn to people who are, in the mating prime ages, just biologically. So that's something the cigarette commercials got right. It's like, hey, you're a kid, you're a teen, that's who we're talking to for the most part. And these tobacco executives or these old men, you're not on their team. They're the enemy. They're trying to fool you and screw you. All right. So that's all good that is good persuasion. So how do you take something like that to the opioid realm? How do you bring good persuasion there? Well, I would say that first of all, you've already seen it. You just watched the world's most effective persuader, President Trump, reframe opioids while you were looking at the other hand. All right. So he does this a lot. This is the hand you're looking at. This is the magician's trick hand, but the actual magic is done with the hand you're not watching. So when President Trump said about opioids, I think I like the death penalty for the bad cases, that was this. And it made everybody say, is the death penalty good or bad? Does the death penalty work? Is the death penalty effective? Is it the right crime? Might it go too far? Is it immoral? Is the death penalty, the death penalty, the death penalty? That wasn't the magic up here. That was the misdirection. Right? And you see him do this enough that you know it's not an accident. Here's what he was doing. He reframed our national opinion and viewpoint on opiates from, and this is just for the people who are not close to opioids already. If you were affected by it personally, you probably already had a bad feeling about opioid dealers. But he basically said, this opioid problem is like the Vegas shooter. This opioid problem is like a school shooter. This opioid problem is like terrorism.
But if we don't get tough on the drug dealers, we're wasting our time. Just remember that. We're wasting our time. And that toughness includes the death penalty. You know, it's an amazing thing. Some of these drug dealers will kill thousands of people during their lifetime. Thousands of people. And destroy many more lives than that. But they will kill thousands of people during their lifetime. And they'll get caught and they'll get 30 days in jail. Or they'll go away for a year. Or they'll be fined. And yet if you kill one person, you get the death penalty or you go to jail for life. So if we're not going to get tough on the drug dealers who kill thousands of people and destroy so many people's lives, we are just doing the wrong thing. We have got to get tough. This isn't about nice anymore. This isn't about committees. This isn't about let's get everybody and have dinners and let's have everybody go to a blue ribbon committee and everybody gets a medal for frankly talking and doing nothing. This is about winning a very, very tough problem. And if we don't get very tough on these dealers, it's not going to happen, folks. It's not going to happen. And I want to win this battle.
And when he talks like that, you've got pictures in your mind of, we say somebody kills somebody, they might get a death penalty, but here are the opioids. So he takes opioids out of kind of the concept level. If you're not directly affected with them, it's more of a concept. And he puts murder in your mind. So he's changed your idea of how important this is and how bad the behavior is of the people who are doing it. So now let's say that you're a kid and you're trying to decide, hey, do I take this opioid or not? Well, the person selling the opioids has not been, but you're seeing the president start to do this, is starting to be, formed and reframed into the tobacco companies. So the dealer isn't just a convenience for someone who wants a drug. So that's sort of the old way of looking at it. It's like, hey, nobody forced you to take a drug. Nobody forced you to buy it. You're making the decision yourself. And that's true. We should make people think that, that they have the responsibility to take or not take a drug. But you're watching the president reframe it into a, you against them situation. Now it's you, the person who has not yet taken the opioid and not yet had a problem, against the mass murderer. Are you on the side with the mass murderer? Because if you are, why don't you give him some profits? Or does the mass murderer have your best interests in mind? That's very different than being the convenience and simply the mechanism of how you get a drug. Now he's a mass murderer. Just got reframed. Now you've got an enemy, all right? That's strong persuasion, but it's, just part of the package. Here's what I think, just to give you an idea of how persuasion works. Here's a potential thing that could be tested. Now, in the field of persuasion, you can simply test your ideas on a volunteer group, if they're the right kind of people, if they've been selected correctly, and just see if it works. You can A/B test different messages and say, well, this one worked better than this one. So there are things we would do today that I don't think they did back in the Reagan era of just say no. They had no science, no technique built into it. Today you would have tons of technique, and every message you could somewhat rapidly test. So you would get good at this persuasion thing in a way that we were just not even close to good, 30 or 40 years ago. So here's how I would make opioids amazingly uncool for young people. I would say, don't die taking your grandpa's pills. That's right, old people drug. The OP and opioid. Do you know if you told a 12-year-old that the OP and opioid, the first two letters of opioid, stood for old people, and you said it with a straight face, they would never forget it. If the first time your 12-year-old heard the word opioid, and you say, opioid, you can remember it because the OP is for old people. It's a drug old people take. As soon as you put that in a kid's head, you tell a 12-year-old this is the drug old people take. When that kid's 17, he's still going to be persuaded away from it. Because he's like, well, the last thing I want is anything an old person puts in their body. I don't want their stupid sour ball candies. I don't want their medicines. I don't want their old-fashioned, drinks. There's nothing an old person does, looks like, acts like, tastes, eats. There's nothing about an old person that I want. So I'm sure as hell not going to take an opioid when the first two letters are old people. Now you laugh, but, instead of telling your kids about Santa Claus, if you say, have you heard the stories about the people dying taking the old people drug? And they'll say, what? Well, old people is the common name. It's actually opioids. Now, if you have a medical need for an opioid and you're an adult, you're not gonna avoid it because somebody called it the old people drug. You're gonna take the drug your doctor tells you to take. It's not gonna be a problem for anybody who has a legitimate need. But if you're a kid and every time you heard opioid you thought old people, by the time you're 17, you won't know why, but it just won't seem appealing. So there's your persuasion lesson for the day.